Hi, and welcome to the Distinction podcast. This session is all about optimizing team performance. So this is one of 4 sessions that we're running, and this is specifically for leaders that are working with remote teams. So session 1, which is available on YouTube, is all about leaders and remote work and what this can specifically do. This session is looking at optimizing team performance. Session 3 is a dedicated session that looks purely at decision making, and session 4 is all about well-being. So obviously my name's Garen. I'm an organization development consultant, and I do a lot of work with teams, both through coaching and through training and consulting as well. I've observed hundreds of meetings over the years and done reports on them, and pretty much seen the good, the bad and the ugly in terms of how teams can actually perform. So we're going to apply some of that academic research to help them today. Dani, do you just want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Dani. My background's in organisational and people change. I spent 6 years as Director of People at Investors in People, and I now run my own consultancy practice. So I've led and worked as part of remote teams for the last 15 years or so. So I've got lots of practical experience in this arena.
Brilliant, thank you. So when we were deciding on the different subjects to look at, teams immediately came to us as one of the most important areas. One of those things is because there's so much research that's been done on leadership teams, and these sessions are all about bridging the gap between academic research and management practice, and making sure that we get as much quality research that actually finds its way to actually support the day-to-day practices. And with that research, there's been some quite incredible findings. So for example, it finds that group efforts actually exceed individual performance more than 85% of the time, because teams are just one of those natural things that organizations rely on to deliver tasks. So there's so much importance placed on it as well. So again, what we've also found when we started, the point of this session is to identify 5 specific actions that you can take away to apply into your work. And then as we go through the research, and we've read a lot of research, haven't we, Dani?
Hours and hours, days, probably.
And probably more, yes. Is we often start with some ideas about what we think the research will tell us. And then as we go through it, we start to uncover some of the myths that are around management practice. And I think sometimes it's important to bust those as it is to actually find the specific actions to focus on. One of the reasons that we looked at optimizing team performance is because there's so much that can be done to optimize team performance. And again, team members, on the whole, only 15% of employees across organizations are engaged at any one time. And that's quite an astounding number. So if you as a leader can actually help engage your employees, that can have a huge impact on productivity, can't it, Dani?
It can, absolutely. If we had a machine that was only working at 15% capacity and productivity, you do something about it. But so often organizations know their teams aren't performing anywhere near to their maximum capacity or effectiveness, but they just let it drift and don't try and make it better.
Absolutely. And the more engaged your employees are, the better the organization performs. So, engaged workplaces enjoy significantly high profitability, productivity, customer satisfaction, lower staff turnover, less absenteeism, and fewer accidents as well. So let's get into some of those myths now that we uncovered along the way. So myth number 1 is fresh blood improves performance. So this is a very commonly held belief, and I'm sure you've seen this as well, Dani, is that if a team stays together too long, the team members will become too comfortable with each other, standards will go down, the team will be tolerant of each other's mistakes, kind of the team performance will plateau. What the research finds is that is not true. The only type of teams where that is actually sort of fairly true are research and development teams. And they found that performance plateaued for R&D teams after 3 years. What they found is that stable teams over time just continue to perform. And the best teams just keep getting better and better year on year because people become more interdependent. They start to rely on each other's specialist knowledge and skill and experience as well. What are your sort of findings there, Dani?
Yeah, I think there's a temptation when you've got a team that's not working well that you change the members, you try and change the people in your team without really looking at the underlying reasons why the team isn't working well in the first place. So I think unless you address the underlying issues that make teams effective, you can kind of swap the people in and out all the time, but you're not going to make a massive difference to team effectiveness.
And also it takes time for a team to ramp up performance, doesn't it? The research shows it takes a team anything from 2 weeks to 3 months to become a really cohesive unit. And at the moment, there's lots of teams being brought together and project teams disbanded. People are part of 2, 3, 4, 5 teams even. And so what happens is that that amount of effort that goes into building that team is never truly leveraged, and that stability is key.
And I think particularly in the environment we're in now, we've got people who are being furloughed and then coming back to work, and they're part of a team and then they're furloughed again. So you've got that constant churn in team makeup at the moment because of the context we're operating in. And
myth number 2 is there's no one size fits all approach. There is no secret sauce that is going to fix your team. Every team is different, has its own workloads, priorities, problems, levels of uncertainty, different organizational context. Teams are human systems. They're not engineered mechanical systems. You can't just push lever A and lever C to get certain outcomes. It's not quite like that, is it?
No, I think it's really seductive, the idea that there might be one solution to this, that you read the right book and then your team will perform effectively. But unfortunately, it's not just like that. You need to pick and choose the best bits from all the best practice out there that's going to work in your environment.
Yeah, and the key word there is environment. You can't motivate people. All you can do is create the environment around the person. So let's take the best research here and just try and think about how you can develop that environment. Myth number 3, and this is particularly prevalent in organizations that are going through struggles at the moment, where the real focus, and that is the myth is it's not just about the numbers and the profit. Actually, what they find is that, employee motivation, there's a big study in the Journal of Business Ethics recently, and this is backed up by 5 studies, showed that employee motivation is 17 to 33% higher when profit is not the primary concern. And that really emphasizes the importance of teams and organizations having what J. Richard Hackman would call a compelling purpose. And Daniel Pink also sort of reiterated that as well. People need to be understanding, what difference do I make in the world? And a really astonishing statistic by the University of Leiden basically found that 25% of employees doubt the usefulness of their work. So they go into work each day wondering exactly what it is that they're actually creating and what value they're creating as well. So managers can play a big part in that, can't they?
They can. It's really important that managers continue reiterate what the purpose of the organisation is, and they really help their teams and their individuals on their teams understand the contribution they're making to that purpose. Never assume that it's known, and never assume that once you've told somebody once that they've remembered and they know. They need continual reminding as everything changes and shifts around them. They just need reminding about the difference they're making and why their work matters.
And myth number 4 is the Tuckman model. You may know it as the forming, storming, norming, performing. And it's something I get quoted to me a lot by managers, like, we just need to get through this storming phase. And you're like, well, how long have you been in the storming phase now? Well, 2 years. It's an interesting thing, and it was a really good bit of research, and it really creates a really good mental model for managers to think about. But recent research, so Pamela Knight, for example, in 2007, has found evidence that storming actually takes place throughout the entire lifetime of a team. It's always there. It's just a fundamental part of being a team.
Yeah, I suspect that's a reflection of the environment we operate in now, that the world around us is changing so quickly and teams are changing so quickly. So every time you change a small variable in either the way the makeup of the team or the environment the team's operating in, you're back into that storming phase. So you never get to a steady state because the world's changing too fast. And
I think that's a really important thing to think about as a manager, as you orientate yours. It's very fluid, it's very dynamic, and it's almost like gardening. You can't just stop gardening. You've got to keep tending to the soil, making sure the right seeds are in the right place, all those types of things. You've got to keep maintaining it as well, haven't you? You can't just leave it and hope that it will work well because you've done the hard bit already.
That's a really nice analogy, actually. I like that analogy of a team of a garden.
I use it a lot. Sometimes when, obviously not in virtual world, but when I do training, I actually take soil, seeds, plant pots, everything into the training, and I get people to actually, as managers, grow plants, because I think there's such a close analogy to the two things as well. Okay, so that's obviously just some myths. We've promised you that we're going to give you 5 actions that you can implement as a result of today. So we're going to take you through them, and each of those 5 areas we've actually identified some sort of key things to think about as well. So Dani, do you want to just kick us off with number 1?
Yeah, so kicking off with number 1, the first action is about building team trust. So one factor that comes up in all the research about team effectiveness is trust. And by trust, we mean that members of a team grow to have a shared set of expectations about the attitudes, behaviours and actions of all the other members of the team. And that as those predictions about are met or not, the team learns to what extent they can rely on each other. And it's worth saying that when researchers look at trust, they talk about 5 dimensions of trust. There's 3 that are really common, and then another 2 that have come along slightly later. So the first 3 are, one is around trust in the abilities. So that's our knowledge and belief in the abilities of others in the team. The second one's benevolence. So that's about the amount of support, autonomy, emotional care and loyalty we expect and receive from others. The third one's integrity. So that's around confidentiality and ethical values. And then the 2 newer ones, there's one around predictability. So that's the extent to which people keep commitments, that they're available and are consistent. And then the final one's around transparency. So to what extent are people sharing information, being open, being clear on what their roles and responsibilities are and what tasks they're working on.
And I really like the fact that you can actually break what is a really big word, trust, down into individual units, can't you? So you can really, as a manager, focus your efforts on which of the particular type of trusts that you want to work on.
You can, absolutely. So why does it matter? So there's several really high quality studies that have shown that intra-team trust is just a significant predictor of team effectiveness. And we know that trust plays an even greater role in the effectiveness of virtual teams compared to teams that are co-located. So some research back in 2013 found that as team virtuality increases, and this probably isn't massively unexpected, team coordination declines and communication gets more difficult. But in teams where there's higher levels of trust, then those problems around coordination and communication are offset to some degree by the fact there's greater trust. So there's a real value in building trust as a manager to make your teams function more effectively. So what does high trust look like? So trust in a team means that other team members can suspend their judgment about things that are going on. They're not going to jump to conclusions. They're more willing to hold back and go, okay, let's just be a bit curious about what's going on here. So you're preventing potential misunderstandings and conflicts. It's also been shown that teams that trust each other are much better able to tolerate uncertainty and much more willing to take risks. So they're both important factors for operating in the kind of uncertain and ambiguous terrain that we find ourselves in, kind of more so than ever now. And then when team members trust each other, they more readily share information and they have a greater willingness to trust in each other's knowledge. And we saw from our last podcast that willingness to share information and knowledge is so important, particularly in a virtual remote world. So how do you do it then? We know that trust is important. So what do you do to make it happen? Well, in teams, and this alludes back to the myth, trust develops over time as individuals learn more about each other. But there are some things that are more important than others. You know, it's not just a case of sitting back and hoping that, 3 months in, trust will be there. So the first one's around availability. So one factor around trust that takes on a much greater level of importance in virtual teams is availability. So researchers found that in virtual teams, if you've got team members going habitually off grid or they're not available, then that erodes trust or it stops it building. And that can have a really significant impact on team performance, regardless of how strong all the other factors of team effectiveness are.
Which is, I guess that's a perception issue, isn't it? So, for example, we're all working weird hours at the moment, aren't we? Particularly as we're moving into lockdown 3, so we're not always available. So if we don't have a narrative around why we're not available, then people will create their own narrative around it as well. Or if someone's actually, doing some deep work and they're just going, offline, no Slack, no WhatsApp, no email for 2 hours to get a big piece of work done, to do some, deep thinking, that would actually potentially be perceived incorrectly and damage trust.
It would, and that's why it's really important that teams have kind of norms, or they establish norms and ways of working and agree how they're going to operate with each other, how they're going to use Slack, how they're going to use their out of office, how they're going to communicate with each other about what they're doing and when they're available. That's the first factor. So the second way of building trust is protecting the team from negative behaviour. So believing that others have good intentions is a really important element of trust. And in virtual teams, particularly, if just one team member engages in negative behaviour, such as dishonest communication, then team trust will decrease. So managers and HR practitioners need to detect this early. They need to look out for dishonest communication and be really intentional about correcting it where they see it, and make sure that team members know that's not the way the team works, and that's not acceptable in a team.
And that can be tricky for managers, can't it? Because it's like, that's a subjective call. It's you being really clear about what is appropriate and what's not appropriate, having a line, and also having some potentially difficult conversations with team members. And they may not see something wrong with what they're doing. You have to go there to maintain the team's performance.
Yeah. So, and I think as a manager, it's about not being afraid of having those difficult conversations, but also not going into them in a confrontational way. Just, sharing your observations about what you're seeing, what you think's going on, explaining how you're seeing the world, and giving them a chance to share their perspective of what's going on.
I think we quoted him in the last session. Again, we're not on commission, but Gervais Bush has a really, really nice model for that, for clear leadership, doesn't he? Which is, how you can share what you're seeing, observing, and invite the other person's perspective in, and to do it just so you can actually understand what's actually going on.
And then the last point around trust is about being mindful about sharing negative feedback. So a key element of trust in teams is believing that team members have got the abilities that they need to perform well. So although you need to share feedback, so you're kind of giving the teams information on how they're doing and where they need to improve and what they're doing well, you just need to be really careful about how you share that. So if you share negative feedback that says, the team's terrible, you're useless at doing this, that's going to really diminish their belief and abilities in their individual abilities and their ability to operate effectively as a team. So when you're providing that feedback, it's really important to make it specific about a particular task or an event or a particular behaviour that's not going to undermine the team's inherent ability to perform the task.
And some of this is feedback 101, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's amazing how often, emotions are at play, or, in the back and forth of the conversation, it just comes out wrong, doesn't it? You're always blah, 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 blah. And then that person interprets it, or because you're factually wrong, then it's interpreted in the wrong way as well. So it's really about being very precise and really planning what you're going to say. So that's number one. Number two is something that's been around for quite a while, but I think it's really important in the application with teams, and that's cognitive load. So cognitive load was kind of characterized in 1988 by psychologist John Sweller. And so what is it? Well, basically, cognitive load is the total amount of mental effort being used in working memory. So some of you that have done a little bit of psychology before, you've probably come across this. So, we only have so much working memory, can only hold on to so many items. And therefore, when we're working, we can, the more of a cognitive load that we have, the more inefficient we become, the more overwhelmed we become, the less proactive we become, and therefore the less effective we become as well. And one of the ways in which we want you to encourage to think about it is to think about the team's collective cognitive load. Teams have taken on a lot of responsibility, particularly in organizations where people have been furloughed. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, people's jobs have doubled, tripled, quadrupled, or had to make some difficult decisions about what can't be done. And so teams are overloaded. Mm. And therefore, it's really important to think about, what is realistic in terms of what my team can do. And what can I do as a manager to lighten their cognitive load? Do they have too much responsibility? What things can I do? Without getting too much into the detail, and we would definitely signpost you to the work that was done by Sweller and lots of other things like on Mind Tools, for example. There's basically three types of cognitive loads. You've got intrinsic cognitive load, and that's basically, this relates to, the aspects of actually completing the task itself. So what actions do I need to do to complete this task? The second area is the extraneous cognitive load, and that relates basically to the environment in which the task is being done. So, that's like thinking, okay, so, who do I need to let know that I'm doing this piece of work, or who do I need to hand this over to afterwards? And then the final cognitive load is germane cognitive load, and that relates to the aspects of the task that you're doing that require special attention, to create high performance. So these are the real value adds that you would do to a task. So if you're doing the task multiple times, the germane cognitive load would be the things where you're thinking about doing it. So in future times when you do the task, it becomes quicker, faster, and more efficient. And when we're overloaded, we can't tend to those things equally. And what are the effects of a heavy cognitive load for teams? Well, research shows that performance goes down, Teams become less effective at decision making and problem solving. They start to use things like shorthand when they're making decisions, and it also increases stress levels. And sometimes the manager can be the source of this cognitive load. So it's really important to be thinking about as a manager is what can I do to ease it and what can I do to prevent it? So how do you measure the team's cognitive load at any one time? Well, there is one method, and that's where you actually look at the dilation of your team members' pupils. That's probably not appropriate. Another probably more simple way of doing it is actually to ask the team in a non-judgmental way, do you feel like you're effective and able to respond in a timely fashion to the work you asked to do? It's not the most accurate measure, but the answer will gauge whether your team's feeling overloaded. And then if the answer from all of your team is overwhelmingly or clearly negative, then you can start to apply some heuristics or some just simple methods, trying to understand if and why the cognitive load is too high, and then start to actually sort of do some things to actually reduce that cognitive load. So when we're thinking about this, what can we do? Well, the things that we can do are, really thinking about how we can eliminate some of the responsibilities that the team has. How can we potentially provide technical training that they may not have on systems? They may be using Excel at an intermediate level. What happens if you could actually give them advanced level? Would that make them more efficient? Another thing as well that's kind of comes from the software world, which I think is quite a good model to think about here, is lots of teams are doing things very quickly at the moment. And in order to do things really quickly, they're taking shortcuts, which are creating workarounds. Whereas really the better way of doing things and a more sustainable way of doing things is actually something that will take longer. So what that's doing is that's building technical debt in the system. And so when we're doing tasks, it's requiring lots of, working memory to require how to do certain things, where certain things are kept. And that puts all the more pressure on the team's working memory. So other things that you can do as well is to actually sort of map out the processes of your team or individuals on a platform like Miro or Mural, one of those online whiteboards, and look for opportunities to automate. I know there's a lot of bad press about things like AI and automation, but automation in this age is your friend. Anything you can do to actually automate tasks or, make them more efficient or just to get rid of them is going to be more effective in the long term. And also thinking about where do I need to hire more resource or just to reorganize the responsibilities of the team. And I'd probably say another thing to be really mindful of is when you're with your senior managers and you're being asked to do particular jobs or take on certain responsibilities, sometimes we don't want to look bad to our seniors to say, look, we're not capable, that we can't do it. But if we say yes to things our teams don't have capacity for, then what happens is they pay the price for this. They become overwhelmed. And, this often comes out when you actually sit down with team members in terms of how many things that they're doing and what's realistic and what's possible. Things that you can do, things like the Eisenhower matrix, we start to map out, looks like we're doing everything in the urgent, important area. What are we doing that could be more in the important, not urgent area that could actually help us start to create better systems, and just looking actually streamlining processes as well. Any thoughts from you, Dani, on this one?
Yeah, and I think if you can get somebody from outside the team to come in and help you with that review of your processes, it can be really helpful to have an external pair of eyes, somebody who's not really embedded in the way you're working. You can kind of ask those questions as a critical friend. And so why do you do that? And often you'll uncover, well, it's just the way we've always done it.
It's those famous words, we've always done that. It's tradition, isn't it?
Yes.
Even if it is horribly inefficient as well.
Yeah, and I think on the automation front, bring in an expert, just for a short amount of time, because sometimes you don't know what is possible to automate until you bring in somebody who goes, you do realise you can do that in 10 seconds rather than the 30 minutes it's taking you to do that. So don't be afraid to bring in expertise just to give you to open your eyes about what's possible from an automation perspective.
And it's that balance that, when we work with engineering companies, they're always doing the battle between production and maintenance. And when you're running machinery, you don't run machinery at 100%. You run it at 90 or 80%, and you put maintenance time in there to make it more efficient in the long term. You upgrade its software. We don't really do that with human systems, do we, at the moment?
No, we're very bad at doing that.
Okay, so that's number 2, cognitive load. Number 3, what's that for you, Dani?
So number 3 is all around team social cohesion. So social cohesion emerges in teams when members like to work together. They form emotional bonds of friendship, and there's caring and closeness among group members. And this social cohesion just helps teams be more effective. We know that from research that socially cohesive teams tend to have greater psychological safety, which helps team members feel more free to speak up, ask for help, propose ideas and solutions without that fear of negative consequences. And socially cohesive teams are much more likely to cooperate and interact with each other, so they're more likely to exchange ideas and share information. And just like trust, we know that social cohesion plays an even greater role in the effectiveness of virtual teams compared to teams who are co-located. The challenge is it's just much harder to foster social cohesion in a virtual world than it is when you're all face to face. There was some research from June 2020 that found that there's 4 factors that correlate with employee perceptions of their productivity on collaborative tasks by working from home. And they found that one of them was social connectivity. So employees who were satisfied with the social connections in their teams were twice as likely to have maintained productivity on collaborative tasks whilst working remotely. So, social cohesion is not a soft and fluffy thing. There's a direct correlation to individual and team productivity. So, put the effort into social cohesion and you create a more effective, productive team.
And that's often what you'll hear managers saying, oh, this is just HR fluffy stuff, isn't it? This has got a really hard edge. And when you look at the research, you look at the rapid evidence assessments, this is like AA level quality research in terms of leading to productivity and positive outcomes for the organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do we do it? How can we foster social cohesion? So the first one's about creating time and space for informal interaction between your team members, so they're not always just communicating about tasks. So there's a lot of great research into nurses who work online and work remotely. And they found that, kind of using the theatre analogy, that kind of when they're on stage talking to patients, they're doing their job, but it's really important for them to have a kind of backstage environment where they can talk to each other, away from managers, away from their patients. And that gives them the space to relax. It gives them the space to get to know each other, but it also gives them a space to informally analyse what they're up to, how they're working, and discuss ways of improving performance. So that's one thing you can do as a manager, is to make sure whatever tools or platforms you're using, that there's that kind of informal interaction space, and that as a manager you're not there, you're not on that space, so the team can work together in a kind of informal way without worrying that the manager's kind of looking over their shoulders and judging what they're talking about.
Yeah, there's this thing about sort of forced fun, isn't there? That it is about taking a carefully curated approach to really ensuring that social relationships develop, isn't there?
Yeah, it is. So allied to that, one of the things you can do to foster social collaboration is really make time for socializing. Don't leave it to chance. Don't leave it to your team members to sort their own social activities outside of work. See it as a core part of your day-to-day team functioning. So create intentional opportunities for socializing, but also be aware of individual styles. So not everyone's going to love a karaoke Zoom session or a murder mystery event, but you can be really creative and find different ways of creating opportunities for social interaction, be it social events, be it creating kind of communities of practice or book clubs and giving kind of people a chance to connect over those sorts of things. I've seen one thing really effective I've seen work in several organizations is kind of informal coffee pair-ups. So you randomly pair up people across the organisation once a fortnight to have a 15-minute Zoom coffee. And that gives people a chance to have a conversation with somebody they won't necessarily come across in their day-to-day work, but, they just get to know each other and they build up links and building that social cohesion. And then you can have things like check-ins at the start of meetings. So if you make the beginning of every meeting, you have just a space for people to check in and say what's going on with them. That just gives people a chance to get to know each other a bit more, to start to understand a bit about what's going on in each other's worlds. So they'll know if they've got 3 children running around the house trying to be homeschooled, or, those sorts of things just help people get to know each other and really understand each other's lives. And then the last thing you can do to foster social cohesion is around teamwork training. So this has been shown to have a really positive effect on virtual teams. So it's about training teams how to work together. So not just training them to complete a task, it's about helping them understand the importance of providing social support within a team, or giving them tools to manage conflict amongst teammates and other things that make teams more effective.
And there is a difference between team building and team workings training, isn't it? I think it's important to know the differentiation between the two, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And both have got their place. So, I've seen some really effective kind of traditional team building events that aren't work related, particularly when there's a higher purpose. So some I've seen that have been really effective where team building's been around been built around a charity event. So the teams are working together on something that they're going to deliver to a charity. So one I was involved in was building bikes for a charity that would then be donated to young people who needed them to get to college or to help with their caring responsibilities, and just focusing the team around something that's got a higher purpose really help people put aside their work functions and roles and just get to know each other on a more
it takes the
level.
politics out of it. It's a higher context, isn't it? And it's not consequential, so you can engage with people and you see a different side to that person, but it requires thought, doesn't it?
Yeah, and you see people step outside of their traditional roles, and people who aren't a manager or a leader stepping up and taking charge, which is great.
So and again, it's so important. It really does require put some time and investment into it as well. There's a lot of stories that are coming out from the Christmas quizzes that have been happening. We had 40 people on the call, only 10 people really spoke. Do people really want to engage with each other, to have drinks online? Not everyone drinks. How do you sort of, facilitate those kind of social interactions to really bring that organization together as well? So that's number 3. Number 4 is virtual team meetings. Dani and I have, and I'm sure you have as well, sat in more than your fair share of meetings. One of the things that is a part of my role is actually I observe lots of meetings and give people feedback on how they go. And I would probably say, if organizations in this country could actually really optimize the way in which team meetings work, this would have a substantial impact on the GDP of this country as a whole. What they could achieve versus what they do achieve is quite a big gulf. So what we're going to do is we're just going to give you some really sort of clear specifics here, and kind of thinking about the model of 60-30-10. So when we think about this, so 60% of your effort should be going into the design of your team and the meetings that it has, how you actually design the task that it does, how you design what it makes decisions on, how it does those decisions as well. 30% should be about the actual launch of the team and how you actually set it up to do really well in these meetings. And 10% of your effort should go into actually ongoing coaching to ensure that the team continues to improve and perform better as a team as it moves forward. So here we go. We've got 5 for you. So the first one we wanted to think about is, when you bring the team together, to really think to yourself, is what it does consequential, challenging, and clear? Okay, so it's the 3 C's. So they sound really good, but what do they actually mean? So consequential. So when this team meets, is it going to have an impact on the team? Is it really that people actually in anticipation of what you guys are actually going to discuss is going to have a big impact on the performance of the team? The second thing is challenging. Is it the content of what you talk about? Is it, intellectually challenging, or, it's actually going to require the experience and know-how and knowledge of the people around the table, and therefore requires the collective IQ of this team to actually engage with this as an issue? And then finally, is it clear? Is it just crystal clear what goes into this meeting or what shouldn't go into this meeting? And that requires you to take a bit of a step back and thinking about the overall governance structure of your team. So what goes into one-to-ones, what goes into project meetings, what goes into the virtual team meeting, what actually needs to be escalated to because we don't have enough authority. So it's all really clear what goes into the meeting. And then people can come into these meetings and thinking something big is going to happen today. I need to pay attention. I'm not going to kill time, and I'm not going to sit here and WhatsApp my colleague while we're in this meeting saying how bad this meeting is. I really have to pay attention. So the second thing is a reflection of the fact that it's virtual. And therefore, we really need to think about the process. Virtual meetings are more tiring than face-to-face meetings, and face-to-face meetings can be like endurance events. So virtual meetings, by their very nature, need to be shorter and therefore more frequent. You need to have clear agendas and papers ahead of time for people to read and feel prepared, particularly in a virtual world, and be very specific in terms of what you want the agenda to do for people to do in preparation. Is that item on the agenda, is it for a decision? Do you want me to make a decision based on this? Therefore, I need some supplementary information, or I might need to come with questions. Is it for consultation? So you, as the manager, are going to make decisions. You're just consulting with me to get my insight. Therefore, you can make a decision. Therefore, you don't mismanage my expectations. Or is it for information? We're going to share some corporate messaging or whatever it is. A meeting shouldn't really be for information only, because that's really boring. And there are other methods of actually sharing that information, and we can be far more creative about it as well. The meeting should not be an inbox exercise where I, as the manager, doesn't speak to all of my direct reports individually. It should be things that actually require the team's thinking. And if it really is like that, then you have to wonder, is it a real team? Does it actually have a purpose? Are you an artificial team? And actually, you might need to think about dividing the team up a little bit. Also, you need to have an annual plan of what meetings should be held and when. When's our planning cycle? When do we do our quarterly reviews? All those kind of things. So we've got some real cadence into the meetings. There's a real kind of momentum as well. And really, we also need to keep a record of the meeting. What do we discuss? What actions have we taken? Who's accountable? Who's responsible? Use a RACI, whatever you want to do, just to keep everyone involved and up to speed. But also, it means as if we're making progress. Life at work feels quite relentless at the moment. If we never feel as if we make progress because we don't measure it, then the work feels relentless, and that becomes demotivating, doesn't it, as well, Dani?
Yeah. And I think as chair of the meeting, it's your responsibility to hold people accountable for delivering on the actions that they agree at a meeting. So there's nothing worse than agreeing a load of actions and then nobody does them the week after. And then you let that drift, and then you end up in a really ineffective cycle of, you're agreeing actions, but nobody really believes that you have to do them. So they just get left, and that creates frustration, and it's ineffective, and you don't get anywhere.
And it erodes, doesn't it, over time, and then people's engagement goes down, and then you just get what you get. Absolutely. And then again, a good foundation for that is number 3, which is setting team norms. Ruth Magaman and J. Richard Hackman did a lot of research at Harvard on the performance of teams, and they found that teams that actually had, really clear norms of conduct, that was one of the greatest predictors of team effectiveness. There's all sorts of bad habits that are just creeping their way in at the moment. People are distracted, they multitask, they don't look at their screen when they look away, all kind of things. And that really sort of creates some bad habits. Also, how people need to be engaging with each other, how they need to be feeding back, what they need to be involved in. Do they talk at topics outside of their own domain of expertise? All those kind of things are really good to have nice and clear up front. And also think about how you want people to be feeling and thinking at the end of the meeting. We don't think enough about that. This is, as a manager, this is one of your primary platforms to inspire, engage, and motivate your team for the rest of the week and to focus them. Yet meetings often kind of fizzle out. It's just, okay, so that's that then. Okay. You want your guys to go back to their workspaces, to their busy homes, or wherever they're working, and you want them to be inspired and focused and part of a team. Think about how you structure it as well. And also, make use of technology. You may have some shy members of the team. Use technology just to nudge people in private chats. If you know that you've primed them in a one-to-one to say something in this meeting, it's a really good practice to do, isn't it? Number 4 is basically just another, is really using good facilitation techniques to encourage engagement. Often teams are too big. The optimal number, I think, is about 4.6 for team size. Teams are often quite a lot bigger than that. People get lost, or people come to the meeting and they haven't had a chance to develop a point of view about the agenda, or it's outside their expertise. So you can use some really good facilitation techniques to actually get people to develop their thinking in the room, to build social connections with other people, and to actually then to articulate it and socialize it and critique each other's ideas. And you can use lots of things on Zoom, which is like breakout rooms. I'm a big advocate of liberating structures, a really good body of work that's kind of brought together lots of really good activities. And activities as simple as 1, 2, 4 all are a great thing if you're going to make a decision. So the way it would work is, 1 is each person individually thinks about the question that you're asking them or the decision to be made. Then once they've done that, they then go into pairs and they share what they've been thinking with their colleague, and their colleague asks questions and develops their thinking. And then you start to bring them back into bigger groups. And what that does is that when you do actually have a group discussion, everyone has an opinion. Everybody feels more comfortable sharing it, and it's so much richer rather than it really being led by the manager. And often you'll see when things are out of kilter, because often when I'm doing observations, I'll take a time segment of the meeting and make a mark of how many contributions are made by people. And often 50 to 60% of the time, the person that is talking is the chair, And that means that you're not utilizing the team and you're not using the collective IQ of the team as well. And then the last one, and this is level A quality research, and that's the importance of doing debriefing sessions and lessons learned sessions. That's where, as a team, you take a step back and you review a decision that's been made and you take the learning out of it. And we, rather than just constantly querying into new actions to be taken, we're thinking about what needs to be done for us to improve. And it needs to be done in a certain way. It's not finger pointing and being judgmental. It's like, what are the lessons that we can do? And one of the things I often encourage teams to do is at the end of a meeting is to spend 5 to 10 minutes just reviewing how was the meeting for them? What worked well? What didn't work so well? What can we do next time? And that can have quite a big impact on the performance of the team overall, can't it, Dani?
It can, yeah. It can be really transformative in the way that the team works and learns from how it's working. But I would say, be aware that the first few times you do it, it will be uncomfortable. And
it's clunky. It's horribly clunky.
But it's worth persevering. So I think as the manager or the chair of that meeting, you have to make sure that you don't let yourself and the team off the hook after one meeting because it felt awkward and uncomfortable. So you never go there again. Keep pushing and making it a kind of formal part of your agenda. And you'll find after you've done it 2, 3, 4 times, it becomes a much more natural part of the meeting, and people will be ready for it and they'll be much more willing to share and contribute their thoughts.
Yeah, and they'll share things like, on that particular point, I don't really feel as if I shared my opinion as much as I could have. And then you say, well, what did you want to share? And I say, well, I had this piece of information. It's like all of a sudden the quality of your solutions just triple, don't they, straight away, because you really are leveraging that collective IQ, and that's what teams are all about.
I was going to say, you don't leave the meeting with people with stuff they haven't said, and then they're not really bought into what's been decided because they didn't kind of say what they thought. So
that's 4. That's virtual teams. Dani, it's number 5, please?
So last but no means least is about developing conflict resolution capabilities. So
we're going there, aren't we, with conflict? Okay.
We are. So some level of conflict is necessary for successful functioning of teams. So especially around tasks, it's really good to have different perspectives on how to solve a problem or make the most of an opportunity. But, where you get relationship conflict around, interpersonal issues or process conflicts, so disagreements about how you're going to delegate resources, both of those things can be detrimental to team effectiveness. So, why does it matter? So the research shows there's actually little difference in the sorts of conflicts, but in some sorts of conflict between virtual teams and co-located teams. So, conflict around task, what's the right thing to do, or relationship conflicts, not more likely or less likely to happen in a virtual team versus a co-located team. But you've probably got a greater likelihood of process conflict in a virtual team, probably because it's just more complicated to work remotely and virtually. So you're more likely to run into problems. So whilst conflicts, interpersonal conflicts and task conflict aren't necessarily more likely in virtual teams, there are some specific things about how conflict shows up in virtual teams that are worth being aware of if you're managing a virtual team. So the first one's that conflict may be hidden longer in virtual teams. So, people aren't raising questions quite so early or putting their challenges out there quite so early when you can solve them. And where relationship conflict does arrive in a virtual team, it's much more likely to be negative for team performance and affect team satisfaction to an even greater extent as virtuality increases. And conflict's more likely to escalate more quickly in a virtual setting as well. So there's a risk that individuals take disagreements more likely to take disagreements personally. So because they can't see the context or the nuance or the facial expressions of the other party, they're more likely to create negative attributes about the other person. And then if you take something personally, you're more likely to respond in a more emotional or aggressive way. And that just makes things escalate more quickly. So
yeah, it's interesting as well, because I think people have got a lot of stresses on them at the moment, haven't they? And you can't always guarantee what place that person's going to be in when they receive your message, for example.
Absolutely.
So it may well be that your email or whatever you're sending is perfectly innocuous, but you're the 14th person, or their child has kept them awake all day, all night. Sorry. And it's just yours that's the trigger. And because you've not set the context or just done some natural kind of greeting on it, how are you?
Yeah. Or
whatever, you just get straight into task. That's the thing that sets it off, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. There's some really interesting research about the problems caused by electronic communication, and they are all linked to the fact that the message gets separated from the context, separated from the person sending it, and separated from their body language. So a study in 2016 found that people tend to interpret emails as more negative than the sender intended. And they're overconfident in their ability to understand what others meant by the emails they've sent you. And then 2019 study found similar results. So our capacity to interpret the emotional content of an email or a chat platform message is really low. And via email, people tend to interpret positive emotions as more neutral and neutral emotions as more negative. And there was some more research in 2015 that found that over 1/3 of employees receive at least one email a day that they would class as impolite or rude. So that's a lot of emails flying around that have got the potential to upset somebody. So all that said, we know we have to find more effective ways to manage conflict, particularly in our virtual teams, if we want effective and happy teams and happy people. So what can we do? So the first piece of advice is deal with it and spot it. So we know, even if we don't always want to admit it, that the least successful technique for dealing with conflict is avoiding it, pretending it's not there, cutting back on communication. So ignoring it, unfortunately, won't help. It's not going to go away.
Or it will present itself in surprising ways, won't it? So this particular issue may not be the catalyst, but there'll be like something down the line when, because it's not been dealt with here, it will come up in something else, won't it?
Yeah, absolutely. There's very few problems that get better by ignoring them. Yeah, so the first thing is as a manager, be on the lookout for it. You have to identify conflict before you can start to address it. So it's about prepping ourselves and our teams to be a little bit more vigilant and trying to spot signs of conflict early and intervene where we can.
Such a big believer. Conflict has got such a negative connotation around it, but it's really healthy, isn't it?
It is.
And I think Patrick Lencioni puts it really well when he talks about productive conflict. Teams have different people with different professional backgrounds, different professional lenses. You will have differences of opinion. As teams, we have to come together and stay with those differences and work our way through it to come to the best quality solutions. But often, teams sit at the other end, which is artificial harmony, which is, even if we see something that upsets us, we'll just try and keep this veneer of niceness going, or we'll have destructive conflict. The teams that can actually, stay in the middle are often quite rare, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. But there's things you can, there's techniques you can draw on. So one that a lot of people have heard of is the Bono 6 hats. And that just encourages team members to put aside their functional role or their own personal views on a problem and look at the problem from a different perspective. And techniques like that can really take the heat out of kind of looking at the problem and discussing the. But
this it's a classic, isn't it? It's an all-time management classic, and it works, doesn't it? Because it makes people more rounded, because it invites them to look at it from the devil's advocate perspective or the it will work perspective. We may not have been in that role before.
Yeah, so there's other things you can do, but I think if your team's struggling to have a healthy, productive discussion about something, then find a tool like that just to give them a different way of engaging in the discussion. So the second thing around conflict is, defining some rules of engagement up front. So it's inevitable you're going to run into some sort of conflict in the team. So have a conversation with your team before you run into those problems about how you're going to deal with conflict when it arises. Put some protocols in place about how you're going to handle those discussions. So do you use a particular technique? Get them to commit if they sense the conversation is going to be difficult, or an online email discussion starts to go off track or starts to get bogged down. Then agree you're going to move it to, a video conversation or a phone conversation where you can bring more nuance to the conversation. Or it might be you want to agree that when things get difficult, you're going to take a time out and allow people to go away and calm down. But you must also agree that you'll come back to it, and it's not an excuse just to take a time out and then we'll never mention this again. Because as we said, it will pop up at some point. And then thirdly, there's an element of upskilling and training your team in how to deal with conflict, particularly when we look at virtual settings. So recognizing that skill in face-to-face communication and conflict management doesn't necessarily map onto skill in virtual communication and virtual management of conflict. So just because you're great at diffusing stuff or talking about having those difficult conversations face to face, it can feel really different when you're in a virtual environment. So it's about opening ourselves up to the possibility that we're misunderstanding someone's meaning when we read their email. It's about understanding that we might be communicating unintentional emotions when we're sending our own emails. And it's one of the techniques is stating your interpretation of somebody else's message. Don't make assumptions, don't leap to conclusions, just explain what you think you have understood by their message and give them a chance to explain what they meant. And you might diffuse some stuff before it even even before the conflict even arises. So that, sharing your mental models with each other and really over-explaining your thinking in a way that you might not be used to.
It's a skill, isn't it? And it just takes practice and a level of, comfort with it, that it's a part and parcel of a good, healthy, functioning team, isn't it?
Absolutely. And then there's been several studies showing that emotional regulation training, so short sessions teaching people how to identify and be aware and manage their emotions, can really impact the likelihood of conflict and how well it's handled when it does arrive.
Yeah, people can be very, don't necessarily able to articulate the emotions that they're feeling at any one time. So if someone's carrying a general mood of frustration from something else, they may not be able to differentiate that this particular task area is not the source of the frustration. This is the source. But people sometimes have trouble unpicking that, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last point for, handling conflict brings us full circle back to the first point, which was trust. So if you can build trust and create psychologically safe teams, you're much less likely to have issues with conflict. So if you've got a team where there's trust, it comes with other opportunities. You're able to notice conflict because you know the people, you know how they normally work and react and function. You're more likely to be willing to address the issue or conflict early. You're more willing to be open and feel comfortable speaking up about difficult issues. And when conflict does occur, it's much easier to resolve, because if there's trust in the team, you won't automatically assume that the conflict is about a kind of relationship issue. You'll see it for what it is. It's just a disagreement over a task, rather than kind of blowing it up into something around, that person doesn't like me, or I can't work with that person. You see it as just a narrow kind of task issue that you need to have a conversation about.
And there's so much good research that you're sharing there as well. So, as I said, we're going to be sharing in the references some signposts there to help you take your reading a little bit deeper as well, weren't there?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so let's just summarize the key points from today. So number 1, Dani?
Trust.
Brilliant. Number 2 was cognitive load.
Number 3 was social cohesion.
4 was virtual teams.
And number 5 was developing conflict resolution capability.
Great. So we're giving you a whole load of content today for you to think about, and you might want to rewatch this a couple of times to get all the value from it. But what we want to leave you with is 3 specific actions from today that you can take away and apply immediately. So what's the first one for you, Dani?
The first one is go and look at kind of what opportunities you've created for informal social interaction in your team. Are there opportunities there, and are they inclusive? Do they play to the different personality types in your team? Number
2 is look at your team meetings, and what it does is it consequential? Is it challenging? And is it clear? Does it fully leverage the collective IQ of your team?
And then number 3 is mind for conflict. So there will be conflict bubbling away in your team. So be proactive and look for it and try and surface it and address the issues before they get more complicated and more difficult to unpick.
Brilliant. So that's the end of our session. So that's optimizing team performance for leaders with remote teams. We'd love to hear your feedback. If there's any specific areas that you maybe like us to do a longer session on, we'd love to hear that as well. The next session is looking at decision making. What we ask of you is, if you're watching this on YouTube, we'd be really appreciative if you just give it a like. And if you'd like to follow more videos that come from us, which will be out really shortly, just hit the subscribe button. And if you click the bell, then basically what happens, you'll get a notification to let you know when the next video is out as well. But a huge thanks for watching with us today. We really look forward to seeing you in the next one. And thank you.
Thanks for joining us.